Welcome to Guy Code, a podcast dedicated to imparting dad wisdom to my son, with your host, Koji Steven Sakai, and friends.
Welcome. This is Koji, and this is episode number 52. I wanted to impart all of my wisdom to my son, but of course, my son already thinks he knows more than me. So instead of trying to tell him now and have it go one ear and out the other ear, I decided to record them here in the hopes that maybe, just maybe, when he's ready, he'll listen to my advice and in the future not make the same stupid mistakes I did. I'll also bring on guests like I have on today. And I have no doubt that their advice will be better than my advice. So this week I brought on educator, writer, Oliver Wang. Oliver, how are you?
I'm doing great, Koji. Thank you for having me here.
Thanks for coming on. Oliver, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, let's see. My day job is as a professor of sociology at California State University, Long Beach, but I've also been a long time arts and culture and music writer. I do a podcast myself, a weekly podcast with Morgan Rhodes called Heat Rocks, where we have guests on and talk about their favorite albums. And I'm currently in the midst of a museum project looking at the social history of Japanese American car culture in Southern California. So cool. I juggle way too many balls in the air between writing, academia, everything else. But I do like to keep busy. So, yeah.
Great. Well, I brought you on to hear some life advice for my son and for everyone listening, obviously, as well. So why don't you get us started?
So see, there was no specific theme, right? Like
yeah.
Okay. So I'm hoping you'll edit all this out afterwards. All right. So 3, 2, 1. One of the easiest places to begin, because this is advice that I give to my students, is to just spend your lifetime being intellectually curious. And I think that, not to get overly political or timely about this, but I think we've seen what happens when people are fine with just sitting within their own ignorance and what the consequences of that can be. And I think being intellectually curious means that you're always an eternal student and you're using every opportunity to learn new things about the world, about yourself, about the people and institutions around you, so forth and so on. And I just think it, in general, just makes life more interesting and fun because you're engaging with things in a way where, again, you're approaching life with curiosity as opposed to, well, I already know everything, there's nothing new I can learn from it. That to me seems like a very sad life to live if that's what you really believe.
Are there what are some ways that you could be intellectually that you could do that?
I mean, for me, I think it's just about cultivating this idea that there's always more that I can learn, and that you walk into new situations or when you meet new people, that you're always thinking about, okay, what is it that I can learn from this encounter, from this experience? So I think that's one of the simplest ways to put that into motion.
And that's really great advice. One of the things because I teach writing, I teach screenwriting, and one of the things I tell people, tell my students is that a lot of times they think that they're going to get the best ideas by just sitting in their room and thinking. And I'm like, it's actually the opposite. You need to go out there. You should be reading every book you could find. You should be listening to every podcast. You should be on Facebook, on YouTube, and you should be out there and talk. And then, when you're in line at Starbucks and there's somebody behind you, you should be talking to them because that's how you get it, and it's a counterintuitive to a lot of writers that's how you get the ideas. And I tell them, my best ideas have come from things I saw on Facebook. Somebody posted something about Facebook and it led me down a wormhole of like, oh, I didn't know that. Let me do some research, and that makes more interesting stories. But I've never thought about that in my personal life. So I think that's a really, really good idea. And also, I think I was reading a study, and you probably know better than me, that the people on the left, they look at more sources of news than the people on the right. I think it's like 2 to 1 or something, where when you're on the right, you're looking at one source of news, like Newsmax or something, or Fox even, or on the right, they're looking at like at least CNN, MSNBC or something, or they're looking at a couple of different places, whether that's, you could probably look at more, but at least they're looking at multiple sources to try to get some kind of fact or truth around it.
Right. And if I can just cycle back to something that you said a moment ago about learning how to be a writer, is I think reading a lot is essential to being able to write well, because it helps to be, the metaphor that I once heard described, and this is actually from a professor as well who wrote it, but and I'm going to paraphrase, but to the extent that language has a rhythm to it, is the more, much like you, when you were learning how to play music, part of how you learn how to play music is by listening to other people play music and by exposing yourself to those rhythms and melodies, it makes it easier for you to master that. And I think as a writer, the more you read and you expose yourself to the rhythms of language and the different rhythms of language that are out there that different writers have, the more that helps you figure out what your own particular rhythm is going to be as a writer.
Exactly. Cool. Well, let me hear your next piece of advice.
Second one is actually in some ways an offshoot of the first. Excuse me. And this is something that was not advice that I would have probably taken as seriously when I was younger, like in my 20s, which is to, to whatever extent you can, is to find ways to travel. And that doesn't have to mean internationally. It can certainly mean just going to sort of new towns, new cities, new states, wherever you are. And I think the more that you can expose yourself to other kinds of communities or cultures, this is also something that will help to fundamentally shape your sense of the world, and ideally, hopefully, give you a much bigger sense of what's out there and all of the diversity of personalities and of cultures and of standards and whatnot, as opposed to staying within this kind of parochial bubble, which for comfort reasons is understandable. But it also creates its own kind of echo chamber. And I think part of being intellectually curious is about seeking new experiences, and travel in whatever modest way is possible for people, I think is a huge way in which that can happen. Now, for myself, again, I don't think it took me a while to learn this lesson firsthand, because when I was in my 20s, I was very much a homebody. This was back when I was living in the Bay Area. And I really loved living in the Bay, but I never felt this pull to travel outside of it, except for maybe going to New York. But other than that, for the most part, it wasn't something that I felt very enticing. And it wasn't until I was really more into my 30s that I realized that travel it opens you up to these experiences you couldn't predict that you would have because you hadn't made the travel yet. And of course, I also became a dad around the same time, which then kind of shut the door on a lot of the kind of traveling I might have wanted to do. And now that my infant is now in her teens and a couple years from finishing high school and in theory leaving the house, I'm looking forward to picking up where I could have been if I had started traveling when I was younger.
Although it is, my son and I, during the COVID pandemic, during the summer, we traveled through, we took a road trip through California, really, really rural parts. We ended up in Tule Lake, Crystal Tule Lake in Northern California. And it was, for him and for me, it was an eye-opening experience. We went to see where my family was incarcerated during World War II. But more importantly, we were in this town. One of the towns we stayed at was super, super small. And there's like a 3-block main street, and every store and restaurant was closed except for one bar and one market. And just seeing that was very eye-opening to me, and saying, like, no wonder they hate us in LA, or they hate these urban centers, because when they look around, this is what their community has become. It's become a bar and a market. It used to be a thriving 3-block, town, right?
Yeah.
And I talked to somebody, and they're telling me how, that's all, it wasn't just the COVID. I thought maybe it's just the COVID thing, but they said it's been since 2018, 2008, the last downturn. And I thought that was really interesting, and it really made me think, that there is two Americas. There's this rural America and there's urban America. And without having traveled, to your point, without having traveled and seen it myself,
right,
I would never really, I could intellectually understand it. I've heard it. Obviously, I've heard that before, but actually being in that town and walking around and not seeing anything to do, or seeing anything that you could actually enjoy, like the library wasn't even open. And, and I thought, wow, this is, very, very eye-opening for me. And this is California. So we're not even talking about Arkansas or some other state that is super far away from us here in California.
I think because of the power of television first, and then of course the internet in more recent generations, we kind of had this idea that somehow the world has gotten smaller and that we're able to, in a sense, virtually travel and see places. And yes, that's true to some extent, but there is no replicating the experience of actually physically being in a different space. It's not just enough to be able to visit it virtually in a YouTube video or in a television show. It's really the immersion that you have in a different space, a different climate, obviously, as we've been talking about, a different culture. There's something I feel like on a phenomenological level that is intensely different, profoundly different, simply by physically being in a different place.
Well, it's like when Caucasian people go to places that they're no longer the majority, like in Asia, for example. And it's very eye-opening for a lot of them. A lot of them don't like it because it's the first time that they've ever been a minority.
Right.
And, and I always tell them, hey, look, this is what we feel like all the time. When I walk into a place, I'm counting how many Asian people there are, or, I'm counting how many people of color there are. and that you don't have to do that because you've never had to think about it, right?
Right.
Whereas like when you go to Japan, you're going to be the only white person in that room, and you just have to deal with it. It's a totally different mentality. And I think that a lot of the people who do that, they come back with a new sense of like, I mean, they couldn't understand the African American experience or the Asian Americans, but they at least have a sense of like that feeling that you might have, even if
another,
even if nobody's saying like you're the N word or you're a Jap or something, right? That it's still like you still that feeling of being, like you said, the other, And can I share a real quick story? One of my really close friends in high school, he was a really, really wealthy guy, and his grandparents were really wealthy, and they're going to leave my friend money. But my friend was a big jerk. He was a real asshole, and he admits that he was a jerk. And his grandfather died, and his grandfather knew he was an asshole, and so part of his inheritance was like that he had to travel for a year by himself, and he had to go to every continent on his own, and he had to prove it. And he only had he had a limited amount of funds to do it, and that's all he could use. And he didn't want to do it because he's like, this is lame. He wanted to stay at like the Four Seasons or something, but he's staying at hostels and stuff.
Yeah.
This guy not used to hostels, obviously. Anyway, he did it for a year, and he came back, and he was a super different person. He came back with a whole new mindset and a whole new attitude, and he was such a nice guy. And I think being in different countries, being by himself, forced to make friends, and forced to not like, I mean, he wasn't roughing it by any means, but he was still like, just being out there and away from all this really changed his whole attitude, and he became a way better person.
Right. I mean, he was pushed to go outside of his comfort bubble. And I think that's something that, especially for those of us who have the financial means to kind of root ourselves in a single place, and we can avoid maybe encountering a greater world if we wanted to.
Yeah.
There is a comfort with the familiarity with it. I think that familiarity also has its downsides. And I think partly, as I was saying earlier, it contributes to very parochial kinds of thinking. And I think more than, again, I hate the phrase more than ever, because we can say that at all times, but now does feel like a time where it makes more sense for us to try to find ways of connecting across difference rather than just being cocooned within our own little echo chamber.
Exactly. I mean, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about lately in terms of our country has been that if there was more of us interacting as young kids, I think our country would be in a better place. So even like I was thinking 3 years of service, or whether it's military or like not military, like it doesn't have to be, but governmental, like national parks or something, I think would change everything. Because if my son had to interact with somebody from West Virginia, he wouldn't think all West Virginians are stupid, because he'd have a friend from West Virginia, and likewise, that guy from West Virginia wouldn't think every Californian is a libtard, because he has a friend in California who he likes. I mean, he has somebody that he thinks is somebody that's cool or whatever, right? And I think it does change. It changes a lot of how we think about each other, because we think of each other as other, not just race, but geographically as well, But all right, well, I'd love to hear your next piece of advice.
Number 3 would be generous with your time and your knowledge. And you can see some of the ways in which the first 3 pieces of advice kind of can interconnect, but and I don't feel like this is like a mind-blowing insight just to say that generosity, sharing knowledge that you have, it's about building relationships, it's about paying things forward and all these things, but partly because I think it's just a worthwhile act in and of itself. But moreover, you never know what, and not to make this self-serving in a kind of boomerang way, but you never know how those acts of kindness and of mentorship, can blossom in ways that become unpredictable in terms of the people that you meet at one point. Again, the time that you spend with them, what you're willing to share with them, this can help shape them in ways that you can then reflect on later and look back on that experience and realize that you had, a role to play in their own development, and hopefully you're getting something, and you're getting something out of that as well.
Yeah.
And so I think for me, I certainly have benefited immensely from many people who have been mentors and inspirations and role models. I don't want to make this sound in a way like I'm burnishing myself, but I do think that I do try to pay things forward in that sense by providing those opportunities for others to just talk to younger people. I mean, certainly as a professor, this comes almost literally professionally. Part of my job is to do this, but I'm really talking about that kind of generosity of time and knowledge outside of structured environments. And really, it's, if someone comes to you with questions, you try your best to help answer them, and you make yourself available, because again, you never know what can come out of those encounters.
Yeah, actually, that's funny that you mentioned it, because I was just thinking the other day how it wasn't until I started seriously teaching screenwriting did I really understand the art. That I actually became a better writer once I started teaching. Because now when I teach it, I have to explain what I'm doing. And now that I have to explain what I'm doing, I have a better understanding of what I'm doing. And so when I'm
Right.
actually writing, so it's funny that you did that. All I could think before was I wish I started teaching earlier, because it would have made my writing earlier even better, or better. But
Right.
the other, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I mean, I don't think you can be a good teacher if you're not always eternally a student. And this,
Yes.
of course, cycles back to that the first piece of advice about just being intellectually curious is that, like, how can you expect to impart knowledge to people if you're not constantly absorbing it yourself?
Yeah. Actually, that's my biggest pet peeve with students, in the creative. My creative students, they always come in and some of them have this attitude like, I already know everything. I've already taken like 3 screenwriting classes. I know everything. I'm like, really? Because I still take screenwriting classes. I still listen to the teachers, whether they might have less credits than me, but it doesn't mean I can't learn something from them. I'll take whatever that's interesting from them and incorporate in my writing, incorporate in my teaching, and so I don't care if that they have less or more experience, or like that I'm a professional writer or not a professional writer. I could always learn. Like you said, I could always learn. I could always get better, and I could always improve. That's really interesting. The other thing that made me think a lot about is parenting. A lot of our time is spending teaching people. And I had a weird childhood, in that my mom and dad I think they never said it out loud because they're immigrant. My mom was an immigrant, but what I believe my mom's attitude was toward raising children was that not to give us any lessons or to teach us anything or give us any rules. So it was very interesting to go through, my 20s learning having to learn a lot of new things because nobody ever told it to me. And that was that really, it didn't stop me, but it really, it forced me to have to learn a lot of things that a lot of people already knew, basic, like from the basic things to just thinking about things. So I've spent a lot of my parent time trying to teach and talk in ways that like my immigrant parent wouldn't want to do, right? But just to tell him like my thoughts and the reasons I do things and why you do certain things certain ways, or at least introduce that, and I think it's been interesting, to kind of have that seeing that difference. But being a parent is definitely, it's about teaching and showing. I thought that's something that my mom and dad didn't want to do. But all right, let's see your fourth one.
So speaking of parenting, this is something that I actually tell my daughter all the time now, especially at her age, as a 16-year-old. You don't always have to strive to be the best at things, but you should try to work at least being competent at what you do. Okay. Because I think that the pressure to be the best at things, that kind of pressure can crack people in ways that I think are not productive. Yeah. And then the other thing with bestness is the assumption there is that you have to be ahead of the pack, compared to everyone else. So there's kind of a competitiveness to it, which to me is not the impulse or the ideal that I'm suggesting here. I think competence means that whatever that you're interested in. So this can either be for, what you do in your professional life. It can be a hobby. It can be things that are personally interesting to you. But whatever you throw yourself into, at least seek to be good at those things. So if you want to be a writer, you don't necessarily have to be the best writer, but try to be a competent writer. Yeah. And so for me, because I have a lot of different interests, I have my hands in a lot of different pots. I'm a DJ. I'm not the best DJ out there. Like, I would never claim that. I think I'm an okay DJ. Like, I'm a competent DJ, right? Likewise, I don't think I'm the best writer. I have a lot of friends who are writers who I think are much better than I, but I think I'm a competent writer. I think I have enough of the craft down that I can do a good job with it. And the same thing with being a professor. Are there going to be better instructors, better scholars out there? Yeah, absolutely. But again, I think I'm competent at my job. And I think competence is something that people, there's a threshold at which other people around you recognize that, yeah, you're good at this, you're capable of doing it, in which case it opens up opportunities. Because if you're seeking people for help for whatever the task or thing may be, I mean, yes, it'd be great if you could get the people who are best at it, but at minimum, you want to be able to get people who are competent at whatever that thing happens to be. So I think striving for competence, it means that you don't have to drive yourself nuts by, trying to struggle to be the very best, but you are putting yourself in a position to be able to succeed. And again, success doesn't have to be defined by some conventional terms here. it just means that you will rise to the point where your competence is recognized, and that it will hopefully, on account of that, open up opportunities for you to be able to do things that you might not have imagined, simply because people recognize, yeah, this person is able to do these things. They have the baseline of competence with it.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think the response for a lot of people when they, well, so for example, like say you can't write, and then the response is, I can't write, so I'm not going to try.
Yeah.
That's the response that happens. Like, I'm not a good writer, so I suck. So I'm just going to not try at all. That's why, I meet adults who can't seem to write sentences at all in an email because they just gave up writing. Whereas if they do what you said, they'd at least be able to write sentences that made sense in English, as an adult in a work setting. Like you don't have to be, nobody's asking them to be Ernest Hemingway. They're just asking you to be able to communicate your thoughts in writing, which is very difficult for a lot of people. That's really interesting. I've never thought of that. But I agree. I think it's being good at a lot of things is going to be important, or being, competent at a lot of things is important. I would argue though, it's good to have one thing that you're trying to strive for.
Sure. But I think striving for competence is a challenge. It's hard to become good at things.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying in terms of, if you're setting your sights on some kind of ambition, you don't necessarily have to aim to be here.
Yeah.
Right.
That's true. Yeah.
If you can get here, it's in a sense kind of good enough, but it's good enough where you can feel pride in what it is that whatever your capabilities or talents happen to be. And again, the point that I was also making is that other people hopefully will recognize, your abilities and competence in those areas. And so,
I was going to say, and it's, you're right in that I think even in the creative fields, I think a lot of people have the misconception that you're either Brad Pitt or you're homeless. You're a homeless actor, right? You're out of work actor. Right. But in reality, there's a whole ton, and we know, we both know a bunch of them who are doing good, who are not they're not famous per se, but they make enough money to have a family and a house and a life. And they're writers who are, not there are only a couple writers that are famous and making millions of dollars. The rest are, making comfortable lives. Like me, I'm doing well. I'm not famous. I'm not, I don't have a ton of credits, but I have enough, and I make a good enough living. And I think that a lot of people get disappointed in their careers when they're seeing themselves as, like, if you're an actor, you're not Brad Pitt. Well, maybe that's not what's going to happen for you, but you could have a great job. Like the first person that always comes to mind is Aaron Takahashi, who's in every commercial, is the Asian person in every commercial, but like he's doing well, right? I mean, we know him because he's Asian, right? But
right.
Asian American, but in reality, it's like people probably recognize him because he's in a lot of commercials, but he's not famous. Like nobody's going to stop him for his autograph, but he's doing well. I imagine he's doing pretty well with his life. And to that point, it's like, you could either get sad and disappointed with your life and feel bad, or you could feel pride that you've made it in a career that a lot of people don't, or never even try,
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, let's hear your last piece of advice.
Last one, and this, everything before this was really more focused on kind of, I guess, more kind of professional advice. Last one is very personal, which is, you can certainly love people that you don't particularly like. I think we all can think of examples of that. I'm not going to start naming names here, but I think for those who are, in relationships where they're contemplating whether this person is a potential life partner or not, you should pick a person that you like as much as you love. Because love is about compassion. It's about, willingness to sacrifice to a certain extent. Being there for people. I think those are components of love. Liking someone means you actually enjoy spending time with them, and that there is something about them, their personality, their interests that you can connect with in a way that is very simple but very powerful. And I think that the kind of, I don't want to say the secret to a long, healthy relationship, but I do think one of the things that's important to sort of like a long-term relationship is not just loving someone. Loving is in some ways kind of, I would say, it's kind of easy. Maybe I'm being naive about that. I think the liking part can be more challenging, especially as people grow and they change. They might go in directions, not necessarily with any kind of intention, but that the change that two people go through over years or decades might, take them in directions where you maybe don't like them as much for whatever reasons. And I think having a relationship in which you have that sustained likeness is really going to be key to like the long-term health of that. That goes above and beyond just whether or not you actually love that person or not.
Yeah. First thought I had was that's why a lot of people get divorced when the baby's 3 years old, turns 3, because at the end of 3, the love is gone because you have to, you went through the infant stage, you went through a lot of sleepless nights and a lot of being away from each other or co-parenting, you know, and then all of a sudden you're looking at your spouse and you're like, I haven't talked to you in a long time.
Yeah.
And if you don't like them, that's the moment you're going to get out of there. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Because why would you want to be with someone for years and years and years to come if you don't like them? That doesn't make any sense. So it's understandable why relationships would fall apart if the likeness, as I'm saying here, ceases to become a core part of that relationship. So to me, it's don't find someone that you love, because again, I think the love part is not that difficult. Finding someone that you like and can like over time, that's the trick.
Yeah, that's the challenge, because sometimes, you don't even know if you like somebody until what time into it. but to go back to earlier advice, I mean, that's actually, I actually recommend people living together first to see if you actually like them and seeing what they're like when you're not, when they wake up in the morning or when they had a tough day at work. But also I think traveling, like when you travel with somebody, you get a real good sense of who they are, and outside of their comfort zone. You find out how compatible you are, like if somebody, like, I like to travel very, I don't like to have plans when I travel, but if I go with if I'm with somebody that loves the plan, then that might be a problem, right? If we both can't come to some kind of agreement on that. But or just being in stressful situations, I think brings that out a lot too, right? When it's like you're uncomfortable or something bad always happens not terrible, but something bad happens on the trip and you have to kind of scramble a little bit. That's when you see like a lot of who a person really is. and if you like that person.
Right. No, I actually think that's great advice, which is that if you're, in the early stages of a relationship, try traveling with them in some place that neither of you are that familiar with, and see what that experience is like, because there's certainly many occasions in that kind of situation where you'll get to see sides of both yourself and this other person that may not have been apparent when both of you were in that comfort zone that we keep talking about. And it may be that it's a very illuminating experience, for good or bad, I shouldn't frame it in such kind of moral terms, but you may learn things that will tell you something about the long-term potential of that relationship by, traveling together early on.
Yeah, that's true. Because you can find out if, whatever. I mean, because when you're dating, there's a lot of trying to be somebody you're not, or showing the best side of yourself.
You're putting your best foot forward. And I think when you're in an environment where you're unfamiliar with a lot of things, it's harder to put on that front, because I don't want to say front, but it's harder to kind of perform this kind of ideal version of yourself, because that ideal version only makes sense in a more familiar context. But when you're thrown someplace where you're not familiar with your surroundings or the people around you, then you're more likely to revert to sort of how you would normally be, because that's the only kind of solid footing you have when everything else might feel alien to you, is you have to kind of go back to what you know best, which is who you are.
Yeah. And actually, I don't know why I was reading something on BuzzFeed. I do read BuzzFeed, where they say one of the lessons on love is that, or one of the reasons why you should live with somebody is because when you're not having fun, you still want to be with that person. You still want to hang out with that person. And when you live with them, you realize that not every moment can be fun, right? You're not going to Magic Mountain all the time because you're living your life. Because when you go on a date, you're typically having fun, right? You go to movies, you're eating, you're walking on the beach, you're doing something that's an activity based usually. Whereas when you're living together, you can't just constantly be doing things. And in those moments that you're not doing anything fun or life is hard, do you like this person? Do you want to be around this person when life is challenging? And that's like AKA having a baby, right? When life is when that baby's crying at 3 a.m. and you both have to work the next day, how much do you guys like each other? Or are you guys yelling at each other over the crying baby?
Right.
Hopefully you can find out before that, because that's tough.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Oliver, for coming on. Oliver, how can people follow you? How can they follow your podcast?
So the podcast, it's called Heat Rocks. Our website's at heatrockspod.com, but you can also find us on iTunes and Spotify and wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can find me on the interwebs. My website is, the one I update the most, which is say very rarely these days at all, but it's soul-sides.com, where I write about music. And you can find me on Instagram at soulsides, SOULSIDES as well.
Great. And I'll put that in the show notes for everybody who wants to follow Oliver. Great. So thank you, Oliver, so much for coming on, and really appreciate your advice.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Koji.
And thank you everyone for listening. Please rate, review, subscribe to our podcast, and stay tuned. We're going to have another podcast. I'm going to start a new podcast soon with Dwayne Perkins and Jennifer Field. All right, guys. Thank you. Bye.